Surely the making of one of the funniest movies ever made can't be that serious, and it really isn't. Okay, 1980's Airplane was a tough sell, and there were minor clashes between the directors and Paramount, and lawsuits from a rival studio threatened the casting of numerous stars, but there was also perfect against type casting, clever workarounds to silly DGA regulations, and a complete reinvention of the spoof movie, all of which made Airplane one of the greatest comedies ever. Oh, and there were fart machines too. And so let's park the taxi, avoid the fish, and check in on our drinking problem as we find out what the happened to this movie. Airplane has its origins in the Kentucky Fried Theater, which the trio of David Zucker, Jim Abrahams, and Jerry Zucker, collectively known as Zaz, founded in 1971. One act the fellas grew fond of was dubbing over serious movies with their own dialogue, a sort of proto-mystery science theater. They too loved spoofing commercials, and so would record them on VHS throughout the day and night. It was here that they accidentally stumbled upon a movie called 0 Hour from 1957. But the plot was so absurd, a former pilot has to man a plane after the real pilots get sick with food poisoning, that they thought they could just remake it altogether. They even named their lead character Ted Stryker, just like Dana Andrews' character in the movie, although they would modify the spelling. And so the script, then titled The Late Show, could be written, completed in 1975, 2 years before the group's debut feature, The Kentucky Fried Movie, hit theaters. The script blatantly ripped from 0 Hour, which must have been easy to do since they practically kept the movie on loop while writing. This is seen immediately as the eventual title, Airplane, even steals the exclamation. It was also once clunkily titled Kentucky Fried Theater's Airplane Flying High. They even took dialogue straight from 0 Hour because it was so ridiculous. Zaz was also concerned that they were going to be sued, so they secured the rights for a mere $2,500. Although, interestingly enough, part of the movie was owned by Airplane's eventual studio, Paramount. But it wasn't just 0 Hour that Zaz pulled from, it was disaster movie Airport from 1970 and its sequels. There's a link between those two as well, as Arthur Haley wrote the Airport novel and co-wrote 0 Hour, the latter being adapted from his own TV play, Flight into Danger. Here, Universal actually did threaten to sue because Airplane was too similar to their Airport series. They didn't even want it to be called Airplane, although they would eventually relent on that one. Unlike most spoofs, however, Airplane didn't require any knowledge of its genre to appreciate the story, characters, and jokes. In fact, most of us had probably never even heard of 0 Hour until we found out it influenced Airplane. But Zaz had trouble actually selling the script, and at the urging of John Landis, moved on to Kentucky Fried Movie, which Landis directed. This would give them some of the experience they needed and made them want to have more control of their screenplays. Going back to Airplane, Zaz got interest from Avco Embassy and AIP at various points, but it eventually made its way to Paramount, and then President Michael Eisner, who first got wind through Susan Barrowald, who loved it and enlisted Jeffrey Katzenberg, then working as president of production for the studio, to sit down with Zaz and recruit them. Despite still being relatively fresh on the scene, Zaz had some conditions that they were going to sell. They had to direct, which surprisingly Paramount agreed to, saying they could direct under the condition that if their work was bad, they would be fired after 2 weeks. Still, Zaz would have to relinquish their insistence that it be shot in black and white and on a propeller plane to further match 0 Hour. Sounds of propellers are still heard throughout the movie, however.
Find out what the 2 sick people had for dinner.
With the studio lined up, casting on Airplane could begin. Another demand Zaz had was that the movie be populated by non-comedy actors, some of whom we now can't imagine comedy movies without. Flying sky high in the lead was Robert Hayes as Ted Stryker, who beat out one of the oddest groups of potentials ever compiled. David Letterman screen tested but admitted, along with Zaz, that he couldn't act. The team would later show his audition on Late Night when they were guests. Paramount's top choices, meanwhile, were Chevy Chase or Bill Murray, while everybody from Fred Willard to Bruce, now Caitlyn Jenner, and Barry Manilow all circled the role. Willard apparently didn't get it, but later admitted it was a mistake, while Jenner read for the part, and Manilow would continue writing the songs that make the whole world sing. While Hayes did have fun making the movie, he would say that simultaneously shooting Airplane and ABC sitcom Angie took a toll. Julie Haggerty, Then doing far off Broadway would land Elaine Dickinson, edging out Shelley Long and Sigourney Weaver, who objected to the sit on your face and wiggle line. Leslie Nielsen, then known for his dramas, would play Dr. Rumack, beating out Dom DeLuise and Jack Webb, better known as Joe Friday on Dragnet. Others considered were horror icons Christopher Lee and Vincent Price. Instead, Lee did Spielberg's 1941 and Price did some voice work. There too was Peter Graves as Captain Clarence Over. Graves didn't particularly like the script, even calling it a disgusting piece of garbage and saying his character came across as a pedophile. Still, he wound up laughing the hardest at the premiere. The role of Steve McCroskey was offered to George Kennedy, star of the Airport movies, but Universal talked him out of it. Instead, Lloyd Bridges won out, after some convincing from Robert Stack. Stack, who was also known for his dramas and Oscar-nominated turn in Written on the Wind, himself would play Captain Rex KRAMER. To nail his performance, he actually looked at comedian John Byner's impressions of him and ended up, quote, doing an impression of John Byner doing an impression of Stack. And you thought there was nothing complex about Airplane. The rest of the supporting cast also has their own individual backstories. So let's take a look. Kentucky Fried Theater alum Steven Stucker played flamboyant air traffic controller Johnny, even writing his own lines. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar played co-pilot Roger Murdoch and himself, as we know. But it took some extra coin, getting his salary up so he could purchase a new Oriental rug. Believe it or not, non-Hall of Famer Pete Rose was the original choice for the role. Through Abdul-Jabbar, Zaz even worked in another nod to Zero Hour, as that movie cast Pro Football Hall of Famer Elroy Crazy Legs Hirsch as a co-pilot. Helen Reddy was originally cast as Sister Angelina due to her role as Sister Ruth in Airport 1975, but Universal threw yet another fit, and so the role went to Maureen McGovern. Stage legend Ethel Merman turns up as a delusional lieutenant, looking like she's still in the 1960s. Good Times Jimmy Walker, one of the few comedians in the cast, has a terrific cameo as Windshield Wiper Man. Here's someone you may not recognize, unless you were heavy into politics in the 1970s. Howard Jarvis played the man waiting inside of a taxicab for the entire movie. The joke itself is good, but made so much better and smarter when you know that Jarvis was a fiscally conservative politician, with the ultimate joke being that he would be content paying who knows how much by sitting inside of a cab with the meter running. Here's one more obscure cameo. The intercom couple who keeps bickering about red zones, white zones, and abortions were the actual people who provided the voices at LAX, where some of the movie was shot. Oh, and we can't forget Otto, who plays himself, of course. During filming, every cast member was told to play it completely straight, as is often the case with the best comedies. As the directors told them, pretend you don't know you're in a comedy. Filming on Airplane began on June 20th, 1979, with a budget of $3.5 million, originally pegged at $7.5. And right away, it was a set of loopholes, language barriers, and yes, farts.
5 minutes until finally the poor bastard is reduced to
Leslie Nielsen, who again was not known for comedy at the time, brought a small device on set that would mimic fart noises, breaking people in the middle of takes. At first, people thought he had a serious issue, while other times he blamed it on Julie Haggerty. He even sold a few of the devices, which Hayes said he played like a maestro. But Zaz had bigger issues than flatulence. DGA regulations said that a movie couldn't have 3 directors billed on the credits, and when Zaz tried to develop the collective pseudonym of Abraham N. Zuckers, they were shut down. And so Zaz developed a plan. Abrahams would be deemed the director, that is, working directly with the actors, while the Zuckers hid behind closed doors. As such, the 3 had to secretly discuss notes in private. Fortunately, that silly little rule of the DGA's was cleared by the guild. Thus, all 3 names appear on the credits. And while Zero Hour was on standby so the team could match the composition and lighting, that doesn't mean they hit every note right away. Zaz had to nudge the actors in the right direction whenever there were spaces in the script to fill, while they had no idea how to write jive talk. This was improvised by Al White and Norm Gibbs, who further taught the speak to Barbara Billingsley, best known as June Cleaver, aka the least jive woman on the planet. But not everyone was quite on the same page. Ross Harris, who played the young Joey, admitted he was oblivious to the adult content Peter Graves was throwing at him, while Graves himself had reservations and thought he was being misled, later being misled by Zaz, who explained that all of his perverse questions about Turkish prisons and naked men would be explained later on. They were not. Bridges too had trouble adapting to the style, asking at one point, what the hell's going on here? Of course, he'd grow fond of the spoof genre, later co-starring in the Hot Shots movies and Mafia for Jim Abrahams. On the music front, for the flashback sequence involving a Saturday Night Fever parody, Zaz acquired the rights to the Bee Gees' Stayin' Alive. The reason it sounds like a goofy cover is because it has been sped up. Another one who appreciated the style was Elmer Bernstein, who nailed the desired B-movie score that stands unique to his iconic works from The Magnificent Seven, The Ten Commandments, and so many more. But if you thought eating the fish was the biggest poison, imagine this. At an advanced screening of Airplane, some reels were played out of order. After some rearranging and trimming the movie down to sub 90 minutes from nearly 2 hours, the comedy was ready for theaters, debuting in Toronto and Buffalo on June 27, 1980, before going wide on July 2nd, just a few weeks after The Blues Brothers and a few before Caddyshack. With such a small budget, Airplane easily made back its money in less than 1 week, going on to gross $83.5 million during its run and becoming one of the highest grossing movies of 1980. Awards-wise, it would earn a BAFTA nod for its screenplay, losing to Being There, and even win the WGA for Best Adapted Screenplay. It too would be nominated for the Best Musical or Comedy Golden Globe, losing to Coal Miner's Daughter. Like so many upon release, today we consider Airplane one of the funniest movies of all time. The American Film Institute would rank it as the 10th funniest ever, behind The Graduate and ahead of The Producers. That list's number 1 is Some Like It Hot, although the team thinks Airplane will one day be considered the best ever. Once all of the Some Like It Hot fans die, that is. The AFI too would rank The Exchange.
Surely there must be something you can do.
I'm doing everything I can. Just stop calling me Shirley.
As one of the greatest movie quotes ever, actually one of the few comedies represented. The Writers Guild of America would name it the 4th funniest screenplay ever, behind just Groundhog Day, Some Like It Hot, and Annie Hall. In 2010, Airplane would be added to the National Film Registry, the same year as All the President's Men, The Exorcist, and more. While Airplane wasn't the first parody comedy, it launched the most prolific decade for them in the history of movies, for good or bad. On the hardly debatable bad side, it spawned a 1982 sequel, the appropriately titled Airplane 2, The Sequel. And while it had a wealth of the original stars, Zaz sat it out, instead shifting focus to series Police Squad, which soon became adapted into The Naked Gun. And despite all of the spoofs that came after it and all of the directors it influenced, including the Farrelly brothers who admit they wouldn't exist without the Zuckers, there is no greater spoof or perhaps purely insane comedy than Airplane. Even Zaz couldn't top it, although Top Secret and The Naked Gun give it a worthwhile go. In the end, it looks like we picked the wrong week to stop producing What the F happened to this movie?
Before we continue with our video, here's a reminder to click the Store tab on any of our JoBlo channels and browse our collection of the latest and freshest designs in our merch store. Go get you some.
When 1980's Airplane proved to be a massive hit, becoming one of the highest grossing films of the year, up there with The Empire Strikes Back and Best Picture winner KRAMER vs. KRAMER, it was inevitable that it would get a sequel. But how often are comedy sequels even that good anyway? When have they ever really recaptured the magic and the laughter of the original? Well, Airplane 2, the sequel, gave it a go by basically being the same movie. Except this time around, Zaz wisely opted out, leaving the production without the strong leaders who reinvented the spoof genre. Instead, they got the guy who wrote Grease 2, one of the most notoriously awful sequels ever. So strap in. No, not to an airplane, but a space shuttle, as we find out what the f happened to this movie, The Sequel. 1980's Airplane did incredibly well upon release, making just under $85 million on a $3.5 million budget. An astonishing return. And so Paramount naturally greenlit a follow-up, re-enlisting the trio of David Zucker, Jim Abrahams, and Jerry Zucker, collectively known as Zaz, to work their magic yet again. And so they did, for about a half hour or so. Zaz indeed got the rocket fired up for the Airplane sequel, even though they had zero interest. This was evident early on, and so they left to focus on the too short-lived spoof series Police Squad, which also explains why Leslie Nielsen would be one of the few stars of the original Airplane to not return for Airplane 2. As Jerry Zucker put it, they offered Airplane 2 to us. They wanted us to do it, but we just, some movies are great for sequels because there's more you can do. But the idea of trying to come up with another 90 minutes of Airplane jokes or Airplane in trouble jokes was just not what we wanted to do. So we just said, thank you, but no. So instead, Ken Finkelman was brought in for both script and directorial duties. And if you don't know who that is, a lot of people didn't prior, as he was more equipped in the world of Canadian comedy television. He too wrote the script for another sequel, Grease 2. So, let's give a brief overview of the plot of Airplane 2. Robert Hayes' Ted Stryker must save the day after it's found that the flying craft that he's on board is facing certain doom, all while trying to win back Julie Haggerty's Elaine Dickinson. Oh, wait a second. Is that the plot of 1980's Airplane? Of course not, because this one takes place aboard a space shuttle. See? Completely different, and weird considering the movie is still called Airplane. Look, there's a reason Elaine tells Ted, I have the strangest feeling
we've been through this exact same thing before.
Oh, this movie is more self-aware than Rock, but taking the movie from 35,000 feet up in the air up to the depths of space didn't sit right with some, chiefly the Zaz team, who, 25 years after the release of Airplane, still had an issue with it, with Jerry saying just the idea that it was, a future mission to outer space or something like that? To do satire on something that doesn't exist? That's a rule broken. Or at least it's one of ours anyway. At best, it would allow for the setup of easy spoofs of sci-fi classics like Star Wars, E.T., and 2001: A Space Odyssey. But really, how different does it need to be? Nobody watched Airplane for the plot, itself ripped from 1957's Zero Hour. We watched it to see what the Kentucky Fried Movie guys could do with a full-blown narrative. So why did we bother with Airplane 2 if Zaz wasn't even on board? Well, because we loved Airplane so much. And so did a lot of the original cast, with Hayes, Haggerty, Lloyd Bridges, Peter Graves, and Steven Stooker all reprising their roles, with Stooker even taking on a blind court stenographer, ripping on Stevie Wonder and Ray Charles. More supporting actors left over from the first movie include Lee Bryant as Mrs. Hammond, the jive-talking Al White, and David Leisure, who played the religious zealot. Added here would be Chad Everett as Simon Kurtz, Rip Torn as Bud Kruger, and Raymond Burr as the judge. There would also be appearances from the likes of William Shatner, lending to Star Trek spoofs, Lauren Landon, Sonny Bono, his then-wife Susie was actually sacked from the movie, John Vernon, and yes, even Hervé Villechaize, then appearing in Fantasy Island. At one point, actor Aldo Ray was attached to play a character named Sergeant Major Gus Greevy, but it doesn't take a lot to notice that neither Ray nor the character are in the final movie. Also in the mix were Kent McCord as Unger and James A. Watson Jr. as Dunn, two of those punny names that get overdone, a la Roger, Over, and Victor, showing just how much Finkelman and company were relying on all that came before it. And there is a lot of recycled material in Airplane 2, even right from the get-go. Airplane 2 opens with yet another direct spoof of a box office champ, but instead of taking on Jaws, Airplane 2 opens with a twist on the Star Wars crawl, with its own little perversions attached. And then there are the flashbacks, and recurring one-liners that rip the original's all-together bit. And a blank? What is it?
What is it, Simon?
What is it?
And there are absurd cockpit visits from children, and jive talk, and slapping women senseless, and ridiculous spinning headlines, and Hare Krishna gags, and Ted's drinking problem, and our hero boring an old lady to death, and Lloyd Bridges posing in front of his own photo, and on and on and on. Even one of the posters was just a lazy rehash, tacking on another twisted airplane. That's 2 airplanes, in case you didn't pick up on that. Another one at least had Santa Claus hanging on for his dear life to tie into the movie's December release. Still, it's like everybody knew that this association would be enough. And so with that script, complete with all of the lazy, or is it resourceful, riffs on its predecessor's best bits, Airplane 2, the sequel, was approved with a $15 million budget, more than 4 times that of the original. Filming began on June 2nd, 1982, just a week or so before the Finkelman Pen Grease 2 opened, at number 5 at the box office, casting a bit of a cloud over the production. 8 weeks later, filming wrapped, and soon enough, Airplane 2 was ready for release. But just in case anyone thought they were behind the sequel, Zaz reiterated in the press that they had absolutely no involvement with or connection to that movie, perhaps sealing its eventual fate at the box office. But before it could open wide, Airplane 2, like 1980's Airplane, had its own advanced screening. But unlike Airplane's inadvertently disastrous showing, in which reels were played out of order by accident, somebody behind Airplane 2 sought to take a little bit more control. As the story goes, someone had the brilliant idea to play a prank on the attendees, reportedly giving out 3D glasses to view the film through, with the audience taking a little bit of time to realize the movie wasn't actually in 3D. Hype was strong for Airplane 2, with people even reportedly getting turned away at the doors of its October 1982 sneak preview in San Diego. But this did not translate at the box office when it finally launched on December 10th, 1982. A quick turnaround compared to the original, which began filming in June 1979 and wasn't released until the following summer. Airplane 2, the sequel, opened at just $5.3 million, putting it at number 2 behind The Toy and ahead of 48 Hours, both also in their debut weekends. In its second week, it dropped all the way to number 6. During its run, it would only take in $27.2 million, compared to the original's $83.5 million. This, thankfully, killed any hopes there may have been for an Airplane 3, something actually teased at the end of the movie.
That's exactly what they'll be expecting us to do.
Airplane 2, the sequel, was a disaster, and more than 40 years on, its reputation is pretty much where we'd expect it to be, with critics and audiences virtually in sync with their takes. It's just a retread of the original, and nowhere near smart enough to be a spoof of a spoof. Then again, if you love the original, and who doesn't, there's really no reason you wouldn't at least like the sequel. You might not laugh as consistently, but the familiarity and variations on the best jokes are sufficient for an easy laugh if you're willing to play along. That said, Zaz's absence was undoubtedly felt, and Airplane 2 demonstrated just how adept and skilled they were at the genre, far more so than the dude who would bring us Head Office. To date, none of Zaz has seen Airplane 2, but David Zucker did note, I will say that there were evidently some good jokes in it, because sometimes people come up to me and say, oh, I loved your Airplane movie, and my favorite joke was, and then they'll say some joke I've never heard before, and I'll say, oh, that must be from Airplane 2. I mean, it doesn't happen often, but it has happened. Surely he can't be serious.